Let's start with a meditation. It will help to settle our minds. So a lot of you guys know what to do, but if you're new to us, I recommend putting your feet flat on the ground. Try not crossing your ankles or your knees. And think about the top of your head as facing up to the ceiling or the sky. And with that, let us begin. There's so much going on in our individual worlds right now, and also in the country and around the globe. And there's something that can be so healing and so beneficial and soothing to just focus our attention to the sensations of our breath. So just find the breath wherever it comes to you naturally. It might be at your nostrils, perhaps in your stomach or your diaphragm, your chest. And just let your mind settle into the sensations of the breath. And just see if you can notice and look at with curiosity all of the sensations. It's almost like we're diving into them with a great wonder, with the innocence of a child. What does the breath feel like? It might be interesting to notice if you find your shoulders rising when your breath comes in, and perhaps falling with the exhale. If you're focusing on the breath at the nostrils, it can be quite delightful to notice if you feel the coolness of the inhale in great juxtaposition to the warmth and the more relaxed feeling of the exhale. See if you can place your attention on the full range of sensations with the breath, the beginning of the inhale, the end of the inhale, that beautiful moment of change and transformation, because as we know in meditation and Buddhism, everything is impermanent. Just feel the impermanence of the inhale as that switches over and changes into the exhale. And then what the beginning of the exhale feels like, the middle, the end. And see if you can notice, perhaps for the first time in your life, that sliver of a moment between the end of the exhale and the beginning of the next inhale. And whenever you get distracted, which is just what happens with the human mind, just let any new thought that comes in float or sail away. Some people think about putting a thought into a car and just letting it drive away. And choose using the freedom within each of our minds to bring your attention back to the sensations of the breath. Every single thought that comes into your mind is wonderful to notice, but think of it as a beautiful invitation to return to the sensations of the breath. Every beat, every moment is an opportunity to return. And by doing this style of mindfulness meditation, mindfulness of the breathing body, we're literally, even just by trying it, reducing the production of cortisol, the stress hormone in the body. And we're flooding our internal organs with health, increasing our immunity, and reducing inflammation throughout the body. All through the relaxation and focus of placing our attention very gently on the breath. And now we started to do this last week, for those of you who were with us last week. Let's once again shift into focusing on our minds. And it's so funny, we're really conditioned to think that our minds and our consciousness is trapped in the confines of this thing called our heads, which we've never actually seen. What if you can think about expanding your own consciousness and imagine it filling the whole room that you're in? This feeling, this sensation of being alive, it can be actually much bigger than being housed just in our body. So imagine your consciousness filling the whole block that you're on, whether it's a city block or you're somewhere rural. Imagine yourself and your consciousness being quite vast. Almost infinite. And when we can shift into this perspective, it becomes much easier to let small things go, minor annoyances or inconveniences in our lives, because we can think of ourselves as quite vast. And with that, any small thing that happens is just a blip within the vastness, the radar of our consciousness. Some people find it quite comforting to think even about a mantra such as I am vast or I'm infinite. If that resonates for you, you can practice that. And if not, no worries at all. And now invite you as an exercise, and as we prepare to hear from Ozan, to think about some way in which you identify yourself. It could even be by habit. The first thing for me that comes to mind is being a night owl, because I'm not naturally an early riser. Think about some way, any way, it doesn't have to be a big deal, any way in which you identify yourself. And now just play with me for a moment and imagine that the opposite is true. Or is it possible that this way you've always defined yourself or thought of yourself as, or how other people think of you, might actually evolve either tomorrow or at some point? It's easy to say in Buddhism that everything is impermanent, and yet it's so easy for each of us, myself included, to burrow down into the grooves of our personality and our habits. And yet we all know through neuroplasticity that we can change, and we have the power to change. And so I, for example, might think of myself as a night owl, but what if I became an early riser, that model of the theoretically overachiever, successful person? But maybe that's possible. Maybe that will just happen. And maybe you too have habits that, if you choose to, could change. If we begin to think about ourselves as being quite vast and infinite, we can realize that if there are changes we want to make, we can make them, and we can take turns and twists in our lives and end up in beautiful places that were never expected. And in doing so, we can pull up a little bit from the groove on the record of our personality that we may have burrowed into in the past. And have a very different future than maybe perhaps we thought we would have, in a beautiful, inspiring way. Each of us has that power and that capability within our minds. And when you're ready, you can stretch your arms up if that feels nice. You can stretch your legs out if that feels good to you. And if your eyes have been closed, when you're ready, I invite you to gently open your eyes. Thank you so much, each of you, for a beautiful meditation and for joining me for that and going on that journey. And I am now really excited and humbled to have my dear friend and wonderful thinker and writer, Ozan Varol, to join us to talk to us about his book, which I have loved myself, Think Like a Rocket Scientist. I also want to invite each of you to really participate in this chat. So even from the very beginning, if you have questions for him, please put them in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can at the end. Ozan is a rocket scientist turned award-winning professor and #1 best-selling author. He served on the operations team for the 2003 Mars Exploration Rovers project, and later actually pivoted himself and became a law professor. He is the author of Think Like a Rocket Scientist, Simple Strategies You Can Use to Make Giant Leaps in Work and Life. The book is #1 on Adam Grant, our mutual friends list of top 20 books of 2020. Was named a must-read by another friend we have in common, Susan Cain, Endlessly Fascinating by Daniel Pink, and Bursting with Practical Insights by Adam Grant. He also runs an incredible newsletter, and he sends out truly a weekly blog every week. I don't know how he does it, although I guess I did that for a long time, but they really are good at theweeklycontrarian.com. We'll send that out to you guys after this. The email goes out to 22,000 subscribers and then some. And he shares one big idea each week that you can read in 3 minutes or less, which is pretty awesome for this day and age. So with that introduction, Ozan, you can unmute yourself, and over to you. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Dina, for that wonderful introduction. For songs, by the way, I vote for Living on a Prayer, Bon Jovi.
Oh, Stephanie, that's a good one. Okay, we might have to do that.
Well, welcome everyone. I opened Think Like a Rocket Scientist by describing how President John F. Kennedy stepped up to this podium at Rice University Stadium in September 1962 and pledged to land a man on the moon before the decade was out. Now, at the time, this pledge was quite literally a moonshot. Many of the people in the audience thought that Kennedy was out of his mind. Officials at NASA thought that he also was out of his mind because many of the prerequisites for a moon landing just hadn't been done yet. No American astronauts had worked outside of a spacecraft. Two spacecraft had never docked together in space. NASA didn't know if the lunar surface was solid enough to support a lander or if the lander would just cave through. Kennedy said some of the metals required to build these rockets hadn't been invented yet. We jumped into the cosmic void and hoped that we'd grow wings on the way up. And grow those wings we did. Just less than 7 years after Kennedy's pledge, Neil Armstrong took his giant leap for mankind. The contrast I like to draw is a child who was just 6 years old when the Wright brothers took their first flight, which lasted 10 seconds, moved about 100 feet, would have been 72 when flight became powerful enough to put a man on the moon. That giant leap, which was taken just within a single human lifespan, we're just talking about 66 years here, from Wright brothers to Neil's giant leap for mankind, often celebrated as the triumph of technology, but it wasn't. It was the triumph of a certain thought process that rocket scientists use to turn the seemingly impossible into the possible. So I wanted to write a book about that thought process. The book isn't about the science behind rocket science, but really how we can take these 9 simple strategies from rocket science and apply it to our own lives, to both professional and personal lives, to be able to make giant leaps. And the book, I wrote it way before the pandemic, but it's become particularly relevant in the aftermath of the pandemic. We're just operating under so much uncertainty. And it's the job of rocket scientists to solve seemingly insurmountable problems under conditions of immense uncertainty. So what I'm going to do in the remainder of our time here is to share just some bite-sized tactics with you from the book. And then we'll have some time for Q&A as well. But as Dina mentioned, feel free to type your questions into the chat and I'll get to them at the end. So one of the principles I cover in the book is called reasoning from first principles. And the story I like to use here to illustrate that principle is from SpaceX. And SpaceX made headlines recently when they became the first private company to take people into space. 2 NASA astronauts docked with the International Space Station. And just to put things in context here, only 3 governments in the world have been able to achieve what SpaceX achieved. It's just US, China, and Russia that have been able to put people into space. So this young, scrappy company beat everybody else, including the established players in the industry like Boeing, to the finish line. How did they do it? One of their secrets was first principles thinking. So when Elon Musk first started SpaceX, he started shopping. So he had this audacious idea of colonizing Mars, sending people to Mars. And he initially started by shopping for used rockets. He looked in the American market first. Rockets were way too expensive here. He then went to Russia to shop for, I kid you not, decommissioned intercontinental ballistic missiles without the nuclear warheads on top that he could repurpose as rockets. Now, it turns out that those two were way too expensive. And on a plane trip back from Russia, empty-handed, he had an epiphany. And he arrived at that epiphany using first principles thinking. First principles thinking requires you to hack through existing assumptions in your life as if you're hacking through a jungle with a machete. So you're cutting through all of these assumptions until you're left with the non-negotiable fundamental subcomponents. Everything else is negotiable. I like to compare this to going from a cover band that plays somebody else's music to being an original singer, an original songwriter. That goes back to the raw materials, the musical notes, to create something beautiful from scratch. So for Elon Musk, using first principles meant going back to the basics. He asked himself, well, wait a minute, what does it take to put a rocket into space? What are the fundamental, non-negotiable raw materials required to build a rocket. And it turns out that if you buy those materials on the market and build a rocket yourself, it would be like 2% the price of a used rocket. So he said, that's it. I'm just going to make my rockets from scratch. So if you walk through SpaceX's factories today, you'll find people doing everything from welding titanium to building in-flight computers. First principles thinking prompted SpaceX to question another deeply held assumption in rocket science. And that assumption was that rockets couldn't be reused. Once they carried their cargo into orbit, they would plunge into the ocean or burn up in the atmosphere, requiring a new rocket to be rebuilt. Now imagine for a moment doing the same thing for commercial flights. Like I'm in Portland right now, I fly down to Los Angeles, the passengers exit the plane, and then somebody steps up to the plane and just lights it on fire. Sounds ridiculous, but that's basically what we did with rockets for decades. And a modern rocket is about the same price as a Boeing 737, but spaceflight is so much more expensive because airplanes can be reused over and over and over again. SpaceX decided to question that assumption, and now we have a landing pad next to a launch pad in Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral. And that's a new thing in rocket science. So how do you apply that principle in your life? There's a number of tactics that I talk about in the book, but I'll just share maybe two of them with you. One is to get into the habit of questioning your assumptions. And the question I like to ask myself is, do I own my assumptions or do my assumptions own me? What am I doing simply because I've done it before? Or what am I doing simply because other people around me are doing it? Can I take that assumption and replace it with something new, something better? The question that Dina invited you to ask yourself, to ask us at the end of the meditation about taking something that we identify with, whether it's being a night owl or for me it was being an introvert, and then putting yourself in the opposite position for just a moment. That strategy works well with first principles thinking as well. So asking yourself, and this is the George Costanza strategy that Dina referred to before, what if I did the opposite of what I'm doing right now? What if I took an industry best practice and did the opposite? This is based on a Seinfeld episode where Costanza improves his life by doing the exact opposite of what he had done before. And the same, even if you don't execute, by the way, the simple question of thinking through the reverse will jolt you out of your current perspective. And then the final thing you can do to instigate first principles thinking is bring in outsiders into the conversation who know nothing about what you're working on. Those outsiders, those amateurs, tend to ask what people pejoratively call dumb questions that are actually not dumb at all. They go to some like fundamental aspect of the problem that you're working on, and they will help you identify the blind spots that you might be missing. All right, the second strategy, so that's first principles thinking. The other strategy I want to talk about is reframing problems to generate better answers. We assume that breakthroughs begin with a smart question, but the smart answer, that is, but they often begin with a smart question. There's an exercise called the $5 challenge that a Stanford professor, her name is Tina Seelig, that she uses in her class on entrepreneurship. And the challenge goes like this. She walks into the classroom, she breaks up the class into teams and gives each team $5 in seed funding. And she says, you've got 2 hours to make as much money as possible, and then you're gonna give a 3-minute presentation to the class. Most of the teams do something like the following. They take the $5, they buy raw materials for a car wash or a makeshift lemonade stand and try to make the most amount of money that way in 2 hours. And those teams don't do very well in the challenge. The teams that do better realize that the $5 is basically a distracting and worthless resource. Instead, they go back to first principles and frame the problem more broadly as, what do we do to make the most amount of money if we start with absolutely nothing? So one team that did particularly well, they ended up making reservations at popular Silicon Valley restaurants for popular reservation times, and then selling those times to wealthy executives who wanted to skip the wait. And they made an impressive few $100s in just 2 hours. The team that came in first realized that both the $5 and the 2 hours were not the most valuable resources in their arsenal. Rather, the most valuable resource in their arsenal was the 3-minute presentation time they had in front of a captivated Stanford class. They sold that 3-minute presentation time to a company that was interested in recruiting Stanford students and walked away with $700. So that exercise, which I absolutely love, shows the difference between tactics and strategy. So the $5 was a tactic. And when a $5 bill is sitting in front of us, it tends to blind us to other means of achieving our strategy. And the strategy being the overall objective of making the most amount of money. The teams that did better were able to walk away from this flawed tactic by framing the problem more broadly as, what are we actually trying to achieve here? Like, what is the $5 here to serve? And once you frame the problem more broadly that way, and once you zoom out from the what to the why, then it becomes possible to walk away from a flawed tactic, the $5 bill sitting in front of you, and find the more valuable 2 hours and the most valuable 3 minutes in your arsenal of tools. How am I doing on time here? Have a couple
You're
more
good,
minutes?
actually. And I just want to invite people, if they have questions. I, of course, always have an infinite number of questions, but if you want your personal question asked, please put that in the chat. But you are good. We're technically going to questions in 3 minutes, but
Okay.
but this is awesome.
No, that's perfect. And then I'll just wrap up with moonshot thinking, which I already introduced at the beginning of the talk. This was the type of thinking that inspired President Kennedy to put a man on the moon when the metals required to build the rockets hadn't been invented yet. Now, this was our first literal moonshot, but humans have been taking metaphorical moonshots long before Neil and Buzz walked on the lunar surface. The discoverers of the fire, the builders of pyramids, the makers of the wheel, the makers of cars, they were all taking moonshots. It was a moonshot for slaves to reach for freedom, for women to take the ballot, for refugees to push toward distant shores in search of a better life. We are a species of moonshots, even though we've largely forgotten it. I think we've been seduced by society to believe that coasting is better than soaring, that small dreams are wiser than moonshots, that flying lower is safer than flying higher. But altitude, as any pilot will tell you, is your friend. Because if your engine quits at high altitudes, you have options for gliding your plane to safety. But if your engine quits at a low altitude, your possibilities in flight, just like your possibilities in life, tend to be more limited. What you strive for becomes your ceiling. So there's a lot of value to aiming just a little bit higher than you would have done before. Moonshots force you to reason from first principles. So if your goal, for example, as a car company, is to just make incremental improvements to car safety, you can do that by just making gradual changes to the design of a car. But if your goal is the moonshot of eliminating all accidents, then you have to start with a blank slate and question all assumptions, including the human operator behind the wheel. And that allows you to then, of course, that paves the way for self-driving vehicles. My life story has been one of taking moonshots, a lot of failures along the way, but several moonshots that have succeeded. And what I do, and one of the things I talk about in the book, it's not enough to just be an idealist and sort of like dream big and then sprinkle some fairy dust and hope for things to magically happen. You need to marry idealism with pragmatism. And the pragmatism part of it that I love is this concept of backcasting. So what we often do in our lives is to forecast. We take our existing skills, products, and services, and we forecast them into the future. What backcasting does is it flips the script. Instead of starting with your current reality, you begin with your desired moonshot, and then you work backward from there to figure out the actionable steps that you need to take to be able to achieve your goal. So my moonshot growing up, I grew up in Istanbul, Turkey, learned English as a second language, and my moonshot was becoming an astronaut someday. I remember in middle school, I researched the biography of every single civilian astronaut that NASA had ever hired and adopted found some common denominators between them. And I made it my life mission basically to hit all of those common denominators with the moonshot of becoming an astronaut someday. Now that dream took a very different turn, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. I ended up switching paths and becoming a law professor. But that mindset of not only dreaming big and aiming higher than I would have before, but also marrying it with pragmatism has served me really well in life. I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop there, see if there are any questions, and then maybe I'll wrap up at the end with like a 30-second summary.
Yeah, that would be
Yeah.
great. And
Yep.
this was extraordinary. It's so inspiring. We do have some great questions. So maybe we'll say a minute or less per question. From Allison Mahoney, thank you for the beautiful question, Allison. Do you have any suggestions for how to catch yourself when you're focusing on a tactic rather than a strategy?
Yes, that's a great question. It's very hard to do because we're so used to the tools and tactics that we employ on a daily basis that it becomes really hard for us to see the strategy. So the goal here should be, and the exercise I recommend is exactly what you do with like trying to get fitter through exercise. You need reps and sets. So you need to get into the mindset of basically asking yourself, what is the $5 tactic in my life? How do I find that and replace it with the more valuable 2 hours? How do I find the most valuable 3 minutes that's sort of looking at me in plain sight, that's hiding under my nose, but I can't see it. So it requires you to be very intentional. And what we do, and this is true for me as well, and I catch myself doing this, we operate on autopilot, right? We're moving from one notification to the next, one email to the next, one meeting to the next, without pausing, deliberating, and reflecting about why we're doing what we're doing. And if you can get into the habit of doing that and asking yourself these questions about assumptions and tactics, then you'll get much better at identifying them as a result.
My God, Ozan, can we have a stand-up meeting every morning to help us with this? That was a great answer. Thank you. Okay, so 2 great questions from Dan Brook. Thank you, Dan. If the moon landing was 66 years after the Wright brothers flew, what do you expect for 2035 when it's 66 years after walking on the moon? And the law seems so different than rocket science. What attracts you to the law? So quick answers on both, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the first one, I don't know what's going to happen 66 years after the first moon landing, but I'm really excited for what's next. I don't like making predictions about the future. I love this Alan Kay quote. He says, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And I love what SpaceX is doing and their audacious goal of landing people on Mars one day. And I hope that happens within our lifetime. And I do someday want to achieve my moonshot of going into space. And again, I hope that happens before 2035. And then on the second question about why I pivoted, so I loved working on the Mars Exploration Rovers project. I loved everything, the decision-making, the creativity that went into planning a Mars mission, but I absolutely hated the classes I was taking in college. I've always been more practically oriented, and the astrophysics classes I was taking were so theoretical and so disconnected from reality. And I would have had to go get a PhD in astrophysics for me to be able to get anywhere in that field. And so I found myself being drawn to the physics of society and ended up going to law school and becoming a law professor. That said, though, I like to just do things for a little while, and then when I get bored, I go out and do something else. So I just told my dean this week, actually, that this coming year will be my final year of teaching as a law professor. So I'm now pivoting to a different field, doing a lot more popular speaking, consulting. I'm going to start my next book, and I want to double down on what's bringing me joy and follow my natural curiosity as opposed to doing something simply because I've done it before.
That's amazing. Okay, well, so David, I promise we'll get to your question after this, but related to what you're talking about right now, very quickly, because we're technically out of time.
Yeah.
From Anne, which is a wonderful question. There's a lot of fear involved in changing the status quo, leaving a job that's making you unhappy or where you're not growing, in the hope that there's something better out there. How do you think about making this decision? And is it irresponsible to leave a job that's no longer exciting for you, but giving you the income you need to take care of your family?
Okay, great questions. And I think 2 things that I find helpful personally, your mileage may vary. The first is a distinction that I like to draw between one-way door decisions and two-way door decisions. We tend to assume that a lot of the decisions we make in life are the one-way door kind. In other words, you take a new job, you try your hand at entrepreneurship, and if things don't work out, life as you know it is going to come to an end. That assumption is not true. It is not accurate for many of the decisions that we make in life. Many of our decisions are two-way door decisions. meaning that you can walk into a new room, and if you don't like what you see, you can walk back out. So for me, for example, switching from being a lawyer to law professor, I could always go back to being a lawyer. Switching from now being a law professor to doing consulting, I can always go back to academia. And so ask yourself how you can take what looks like a one-way door decision and convert it to a two-way door. And often this requires running small experiments on the side to see if things are going to work. So I've been building my online platform and my speaking platform, consulting platform for the past 2 years. So this isn't a decision I'm just making, this week because I decided I'm, teaching law is no longer exciting me. It's been something that I've been thinking about for a while, and I've been running these small experiments on the side. And when I see those experiments bear fruit, that gives me some hope about what tomorrow holds.
Oh my God, very apropos and terrifying and inspiring at the same time. We have a wonderful question from David Neinstein. Thank you, David. How have you brought any of the strategies you've discussed or others that are in the book to your personal life that have made a large continuous impact on your life?
One very recent example. My book came out on April 14th. I had this big book tour planned. And of course, with the pandemic shutting travel down, the book tour got canceled. And I, by the way, spent 2 days just being miserable and wishing for reality to be different than it was, and wishing for a universe to deal me a better hand, which is a completely futile exercise. So I went back to thinking like a rocket scientist and asked myself, all right, I can't do the book tour, but how can I play the hand that the universe dealt me? And so I came up with creative ways of getting the word out online. I partnered with other authors to do virtual book launch events to get the word out. And the pandemic basically forced me to reason from first principles. To be honest with you, I was doing the book tour. I had planned the book tour, not because it was the best tactic in service of the overall strategy for spreading the ideas about the book to the world, but because that's what other authors do. I was just copying and pasting what they did. You write a book, you go on a book tour. But it turns out doing a physical book tour is really time intensive. And I think the creative strategies that I was able to come up with, the creative tactics through online means, ended up reaching a far bigger audience than a physical book tour would have been.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, he was brilliant. If anyone has questions on that, you can ask me or ask him. You got me to buy books for my whole team, a bunch of people. So it was really effective and super inspiring. Ozan, you've been so generous with your time and your expertise. How can we as a community support you?
So if you'd like to keep in touch with me, I'm not active on social media. The best way to do is through my email list, as Dina mentioned, and you can sign up for that at weeklycontrarian.com. If your company or organization brings in keynote speakers, or you need help with implementing this moonshot process at your institution, you can head over to ozanvarol.com/speaking to reach out to me about that. And I also have a membership community called the Inner Circle, where we hold monthly coaching calls basically, and I share additional tactics like this with the community. And you can find out about that at ozanvarol.com/inner circle.
And we'll send this all out to everyone. And he's so humble. He's not mentioning that he has an incredible mastermind group that he's literally launching right now that I think will appeal to several of the folks that are on, or to everyone, many of the folks that are on this call right now. So we'll send that all out to you guys as well. So Ozan, thank you for the inspiration to think contrarian and go for the moonshots and two-door thinking. It's extraordinary and very applicable to each of our lives and each of the decisions that we're making, especially during this time. So I thank you.